Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. First off, I'd like to say a big thank you to our sponsors, BOTB. Just like me, BOTB have recently put the pedal to the metal and are now running 2 competitions a week. One dream car, which now comes with £50,000 cash, and one midweek competition. They've 150 different cars to choose from, with tickets available from £1.50. And if you're a Jag man, you could choose an F-Type R from just £3.30, a classic E-Type for £3.15, or the mighty F-Pace SVR for £2.85. And every one of those will come with 50 grand in the boot. If you want a chance to win, check out the link in the description down below, which will tell you how to enter, and all the full T's and C's will be on the website. You must be 17 or over to enter. This is what Jaguar call the new F-Type. And if you hadn't noticed that there was a new F-Type, you'd be entirely forgiven. This car is now 8 years old, and in 2020, most companies for its 7th birthday would have been replacing this car, sending it out to pasture. Jaguar instead gave this merely a mild facelift. In terms of changes, it hasn't really been a dramatic overhaul. The biggest difference visually is from the front, where you have a new bumper, a new lighting arrangement, these new bonnet vents, and not everyone's in love with it, but actually I kind of like it. It's a really good look. If only Aston Martin could get their cars to be this cohesive. At the rear, it's not quite as dramatic a transformation, with some new LED lights and a slightly different bumper. On the inside, the big change really is the fitment of Jaguar's fairly mediocre digital cockpit as standard. Really, the biggest change has been in the model lineup itself, because the mid-range supercharged V6 is no more. Sadly, manuals have also been chucked out as well, presumably for reasons of emissions. What you're left with is a choice between the 4-cylinder 2-litre 300 horsepower turbo, and if you want to buy one of those, I'm afraid we can't be friends. It's not that I don't think 4-cylinders belong in sports cars, it's just that that engine isn't really a very good one and has no place in this car. The rest of the range is made up of the 5-litre supercharged V8. The old SVR has now gone, but the new R is essentially the SVR in all but name, having the same 575 horsepower engine and all of its suspension tweaks. The new model is this one, the P450, having a slightly down-tuned version of the supercharged V8, making, you guessed it, 450 horsepower, and this is available in both rear or all-wheel drive. And today I've got the all-wheel drive one because that seemed like the best thing to ask for in the middle of January. This is my first meaningful experience of an F-Type coupe, and I've got to say, despite its age, in here does feel pretty special. The trim of this first edition car is very nice. You've got black leather, Windsor leather they call it, with contrast stitching. There's Alcantara on top of the dash here, which is fine because you don't have to touch it. Beautiful leather steering wheel with perforations on it, really nice to hold. There are of course some weak points, common with many other JLR products like the F-Pace I had recently. Buttons on the steering wheel feel a little bit cheap, these forward window switches really must go, and the Meridian sound system is average at best. But the overall layout in here really is perfect. Unlike the 992 911 that I drove last week, you can actually see everything in here. The HVAC controls are nice, simple dials. It really is a very well laid out and thought out cockpit. It was always at the rear where I had the biggest problem with the F-Type. I like my cars to have a bit of a flourish at the back, something just to finish them off, like the old XK had its little flick. This just kind of vanishes into nothingness. Now you can get a fixed spoiler on here like the old SVR, but it really doesn't look that great. The overall shape of the F-Type really has never been one that appeals to me. However, the coupe is certainly a lot more practical than the convertible, which has pretty pitiful storage space. This one you can fit about £1 million worth of contraband in. And bizarrely, Jaguar also offer a powered tailgate as an option. And I really don't know why you would want or need a tailgate this small to be powered. That seems just bizarre to me. For the self-loathing individual, the 4-cylinder F-Type is available from about £56,000, putting it roughly in line with Porsche's 718 entry-level models. However, this P450 all-wheel drive first edition with a few toys thrown at it is £85,000. Almost exactly the same price as the base Carrera 2 911 that we drove on the channel only a week ago. So with its aging platform, can the newly refreshed Jaguar have any hope of standing up to the might of Stuttgart? The F-Type isn't merely functional in a world of cars which are much better. This really does stand out as now an almost unique experience, certainly at the price point. And indeed, there is a lot that the Jaguar does quite wrong. When you first get in it and start to put your foot down, it doesn't really feel quite as quick as you'd imagine a 5-litre supercharged V8 should. It's not slow by any stretch of the imagination, and it makes the right noises. But there's no escaping the fact that this is a power plant which has been deliberately detuned. It's well known that this can make close to 700 horsepower without any real big issues. So here in 450 horsepower, guys, it is very severely held back. That seems to mostly manifest itself in the bottom end response. You'd think that a car with such capacity and power and torque would have no trouble whatsoever pulling from about 2000 RPM. And it's not that it's reluctant to, it's just that it doesn't have the savagery you expect. The last thing I got out of was the F-Pace SVR, and that does have the punch you expect because it's got the full-fat version of the engine. Well, nearly full-fat 550 brake versus the 575 brake one you'll get in the new F-Type R. This car is around 70 brake horsepower up on the base 911 that I drove the other week. However, it doesn't feel any quicker. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, and the numbers would back this up, that this is the slower car. Why is that? Well, one very simple reason. This may be up on power, but it's also significantly up on weight versus the Carrera. That weighs in officially at 1,505 kilos, whereas this one is about a quarter of a ton heavier. In fact, even the 4-cylinder F-Type is still much larger than the 911. That is presumably because in the creation of this car, they haven't really taken anything away from the R, which means that it gets another 125 horsepower and not a single extra kilo. If you do want a slightly lighter car, the rear-wheel drive version is going to save you about 90 kilos. But the all-wheel drive version does have exceptional traction, and in some ways the engine's new mapping does help because it now feels more naturally aspirated. Because it doesn't have that low-down savagery, you'll more want to really give it the beans and rev it out, and there certainly is a reward for doing so. It pulls noticeably harder at about 3,500 RPM, and then again at 5 before running to its sort of 6,500 to 7,000 RPM red line. This is still an engine with plenty of character. Jaguar's work on the gearbox also seems to have borne fruit because it is a little bit better than I recall. In fact, when you're really pressing on, I'd say this thing responds better and shifts just as quickly as Porsche's new 8-speed PDK. Those upshifts are often accompanied by a lovely crackle from the exhaust, and I have to say that Jaguar are one of the few companies to have really benefited from the new noise regs, because this car seems just about right in terms of volume. The old F-Type R was absolutely maddening. I followed a couple and they sounded like people hurling firecrackers out of the car at any opportunity. This one, much more sensible. There is an exhaust button down here still, and it does actually have a mild effect. Lovely sounding thing. Does make you feel like you're in a proper old school car. And indeed there is a lot that is, I guess, kind of old school about this now. The view out, fantastic. You can actually see quite a bit of that bonnet, which makes it feel just a little bit easier to place on the road. In fact, compared with the F-Pace, which is a bus, this thing is an absolute delight. I can thread down my favourite roads with far greater ease. Rear visibility is not so great, and the rear left 3/4 is pretty poor. You've got something of a porthole behind you, but once that little spoiler pops up, that kind of robs some of your visibility, although not really anything that actually mattered. On occasion, the downshifts can be a little bit reluctant, but that actually to me felt more like the paddle not sending the instruction rather than the gearbox simply ignoring me. In drive mode, it's actually a pretty decent thing, as most torque converter autos are. However, it has a real propensity to try and just get you into 8th as quickly as it can, and in a lot of scenarios that means this engine's ticking over at about 1,000 RPM, where it has no go at all, so there is somewhat of a delay when you need to push on. Sport mode, however, is pretty decent, so if you do want to drive quickly and not change gear yourself, it's a good way to do it as any. ride quality in the F-Type, I'd say, is pretty decent. Maybe not quite as good as the 911, but so close as to not matter. This has a double wishbone setup front and rear versus the McPherson strut at the front and multi-link rear of the 911. Turning is perhaps not quite so keen in the Jag as it is in the Porsche, but this has a more consistent weighting to it, and it's a helm that I can really rely on. The car does communicate its grip levels fairly well. And with the all-wheel drive system, even in these inclement conditions, you can really pile into a corner and generally you'll be all right. I've thrown this car into a few fairly challenging bends, deliberately trying to provoke a little understeer, and I know some will come, but honestly the Jag's ability is much higher than you'd think. Fuel economy hasn't been spectacular, mostly because I have been enjoying myself. I expect on a run this will perform similarly to the SVR, which I had last year, and that did something like 28 to 29 to the gallon on the motorway. For a car of that kind of power and weight, that's pretty good. The quality of the materials in here, this lovely Alcantara roof lining, that view out the front, the feel of this steering wheel, these all add up to a driving experience which to me does feel really quite nice. It stands above something like, say, the outgoing BMW M4. It really does feel like a proper sports car / GT experience. All of the controls are where you want them, they're pretty easy to find. You have a couple of bits of theatre, like that spoiler at the back, the little air vents that like to pop up here, and the contrast stitching stops this from becoming a really monotonous and bland interior. Okay, so once you to change up at about 6,000 RPM, that's when the dash starts blinking and flashing. It is an absolute shame that Jaguar couldn't have engineered an actual naturally aspirated version of this engine to put in this car, but I guess that would have involved an awful lot of work and expense on their behalf, which probably wouldn't have been justified. I expect there are a lot of people out there who'd probably be eyeing something like this up and thinking, well, hang on a minute, surely just a remap is going to get you up to our power levels, and I don't think that's probably wrong. The R is some £20,000 more than this, and I think for most people in most situations this really is going to be enough. It delivers you the experience, it really does. You just listen to it, absolutely glorious. The short gearing actually works quite well because it means you can work through the rev range, you can enjoy it, the noise, the performance, the drama, without going silly fast. But if you do really want to press on, she's very happy to do that as well. The brakes are traditional steel items, but the pedal feel is great. Absolutely no issue with them whatsoever. I love carving the roads with this thing. It's a really enjoyable car. Sure, I think for the purist, the rear-wheel drive would be the one that appeals, and it's a £5 saving too, which is nice. But for all year-round usability, the all-wheel drive does give you that little extra safety net that I think a lot of people would appreciate. I absolutely love the 911, I really do, and I hope Porsche can get it right again. But if you're currently on the hunt for a decent, daily drivable, all year round usable sports car, I would say that you would be doing yourself a great disservice if you didn't at least try the Jaguar F-Type. The F-Pace gave me some problems because one morning it refused to start, and I've no doubt, sharing a lot of the same electrical systems, that one day you may have a similar problem with your F-Type. However, the F-Pace is a car that in many ways is somewhat ordinary. Okay, the SVR is a little bit special, but it should be a decent, dependable vehicle. The F-Type, though, has enough about it which is really, truly special that I think makes it worth taking that risk. If people come to me now and say they're thinking of something like this, I would say, yeah, go for it. Once upon a time, when I had my Lotus Evora, I considered that a superior car, particularly compared to the V6 F-Type, and it certainly was. I'll stand by that assessment. However, Lotus subsequently went bananas with their pricing, and so now for what Jaguar want for one of these, I'm not sure you can even get an Evora, really. Well, by the end of this year, you won't be able to get one at all. So often Jaguars are compared with Aston Martins, and indeed I can see the very many valid reasons as to why you might do that. But the new Aston Martin V8 Vantage was something of a misfire. This Jaguar offers much of the things you want from an Aston. Nice big V8 engine, reasonably luxurious interior, decent badge, being somewhat rarer than a Porsche. And in all honesty, right here, right now, I'm struggling to think what the Aston would offer that the Jaguar doesn't. In fact, this is far better packaged. I think for once the Jaguar maybe is the better looking car. Certainly from the front end it has it. The rear, not so much. Both have their issues. But it has the usability, the practicality, and most importantly, that excitement. It's the kind of car that is going to give you that real desire to just pop out for a drive. To say, oh honey, I forgot the milk. Is this car somewhat tainted by knowing that there is a much faster version available? Maybe a touch. Is it actually worse for it? Nah, it's fabulous. Stop worrying about the numbers, get yourself into an F-Type, have a drive, because this car just does the business. It works. It's a proper Jag. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.